And let's finally just pick up that point on China, the extraordinary threat of China. And we had a very interesting question. Let me just find it. Where are we now? 2 minutes. Here we are. This is from. Where am I now? Oh dear, terribly bad. Just trying to. There we are. Tom. This is from Tom. Tom in Devon, and Tom heard a remark that I made that the West is lost if China proves able to innovate whilst at the same time remaining a totalitarian power. And he says, well, isn't there a very interesting, it's a really good point, isn't there an interesting, possibly counterexample or perhaps parallel? He says, whether or not the brief but notable flourishing of the sciences within the early Islamic empire, termed the Islamic Golden Age, wasn't just such an example of innovation within an otherwise repressive and totalitarian political system. What an interesting point. I thought about this a bit, and I think the parallel is pretty well exact. What is called the Islamic Golden Age is early in Islam. Remember, Islam is a religion that spreads by conquest, by the astonishingly rapid collapse of the two great Mediterranean empires in the face of Islam, the Eastern Roman Empire on the one hand, and on the other hand, the empire on the other side of the Euphrates, the empire of Persia. Both of these collapse in the face of Islam. And what I think happens, why you get this efflorescence of Islamic culture, is that it's this moment of, remember, all of them had by this point monotheistic religions. The Roman Empire had adopted Christianity, the Persian Empire was Mithraic, Zoroastrian sun worship was Zoroastrian, and obviously Islam is a passionately monotheistic religion as well. So there was quite a lot in common of the belief systems. But of course, the Arabs were a backward tribal society, conquering in the Eastern Roman Empire and in Persia the two most sophisticated culturally, architecturally, commercially, administratively, and intellectually and scientifically powers in the world at that, setting aside China in the Far East, and in the Western Hemisphere, the most sophisticated powers. And I think what happens is there is this moment of, if you like, cultural collision between the primitive monotheism of Islam and these more complex and richer, more varied societies. And the beginnings of that conflict, which is both a conflict and a confluence, it's both a conflict and a coming together, to begin with, clearly is extremely fruitful, as one sees in India, the way in which a fusion of the cultures native to the subcontinent with British culture, with English culture, have been astonishingly productive. And I think that's what happens in early Islam. It's cultural fusion. What is striking, though, as you say, is that it doesn't develop. That precisely the absence of freedom, the rigidities of the Islamic faith and whatever, prevent any kind of continuous growth or development, such as we've seen supremely in the West since the 15th century, which, remember, is completely unique in human history in terms of a civilization that continuously renews, grows, develops, challenges, shifts itself in this extraordinary fashion. And my guess is, I hope, that what we're seeing in China is that simply that first stage of cultural fusion. Because again, when people go on about globalization, or they go on about the relationship between the West and the rest of the world, every human society in the 19th century was confronted with the need to come to terms with the creation of that new world of industrialization, that new world of the city, that new world of galloping technology, that new world of perpetual outpouring of ideas, which, as I've constantly said, begins essentially in England, in London, and you can really date it. You can date the moment of the final explosion to the end of the 17th century with Locke and Newton and all the rest of it. All the world had to come to terms with that. Sometimes it came to terms with it by compulsion. It was, in other words, conquest by essentially Britain, by the British fleet. But countries that escape conquest, like Japan, like China, nevertheless have to come to terms. They have to modernize. Japan does it itself by the extraordinary Meiji Restoration of the end of the 19th century, and a deliberate introduction of industrial society into Japan, but on Japan's own terms. I have in the room downstairs where I'm writing my autobiography, I have a fascinating example of that process. It's a handbook which is produced by the Platt brothers in Oldham, at one point the world's largest engineering factory, making cotton machinery, where my father worked. Well, my father trained as an apprentice. And the catalogue is a very beautiful printed catalogue, and it shows the destinations of the machinery that was being made by Platt Brothers in Oldham. One of the great stars of the mills, the new mills in Japan. And you see the first ones, these little tiny things that look like cottage mills in the 1860s. And then by the 1890s and the early 1900s, you have factories that rivaled anything in England. In other words, Platt Brothers was building its own demise by its sales to Japan, which was modernizing on its own terms. And China, of course, modernizes on its own terms as a result of the civil wars of the 20th century and the extraordinary and hideous waves of revolutionary change that take place under communist rule in China. And they import, as we know, they import Western ideas, and there's been this gigantic shift even when Hong Kong was taken over by China. It stood out as again another example of cultural confluence, of this coming together of you know, that unbelievable Chinese industry and that ant-like, I know one gets denounced as a racist for saying it, but that ant-like capacity for joint activity, each one being apparently passionately individualistic, but getting on and pulling together in this collective endeavour, and very, very distinctly free market notions. There was the Secretary of Hong Kong, of the Hong Kong colonial administration, called Cooperthwaite, who deliberately turns Hong Kong into a kind of essay of free market, Friedmanesque economics, and you get this fusion of the Chinese industrial model and an extreme version of the Western free market model coming together in this extraordinary society. Well, when Hong Kong was taken over by China, it stood out. Now, of course, the Hong Kong example has spread way out from the south, covering more and more with new megacities, each one of them looking much like Hong Kong and behaving much like Hong Kong, spreading out from the south of China up north, east and west. Astonishing transformation. But cultural confluence, not yet cultural self-generation. Do you remember, again, there was all the talk a couple of decades ago that Japan was going to overtake the West. It hasn't. it's frozen. There's a sort of, everybody talks about it as the Japanese disease. And its astonishing economic growth, again, has faltered, has halted. I wonder whether the most extraordinary example of this process of cultural clash, fertilization, we could call it cultural fusion and cultural fission, couldn't we? There's a quality about it which is almost like, atomic energy. It's the coming together in this vast explosion. The really interesting one, about which I know nothing at all, and I don't understand it, and I don't pretend to understand it, what on earth is going on in South Korea? Because that really does look as though it's generating a unique and highly creative society, not simply remarkable industrially, but creatively in worlds of fantasy, of fashion, of film, of pop music, and whatever, in ways that are genuinely original and seem to be genuinely self-sustaining. But so far, it's pretty unique, and it's, thank heavens, as far as possible from what one can see going on in China itself. So there may still be hope for us. Hello, and thank you for watching David Starkey Talks. If, as I very much hope, you're enjoying them, why not become more actively involved and join my members club? As a member, you'll be able to take part in the members-only weekly question and answer session, suggest topics for forthcoming videos, and have priority booking for my forthcoming live events. And while you're at it, why not have a look at the store page on my website, davidstarkey.com. There you can purchase t-shirts and other merchandise, buy signed copies of my books, and, if you're feeling brave and a bit flush, even arrange to take me out to lunch. Thank you once again for watching. I look forward to hearing from you and to welcoming you to my members club.